to start recording. All right, so we're gonna go over some highlighting today. We're gonna talk about theory a little bit, and we're gonna do a little demonstration here. Do this. All right, so I guess something I wanted to get out of the way first is we're not gonna be talking about this kind of highlighting, like heavy metal style edge highlighting. I particularly don't work this way. I'm not the best instructor for something like this. The only thing to figure out with this is find all the edges and trace them. That's all that's really going on here. You can see it's like flat colors basically everywhere else. So if you want to do this, it's just a lot of practice tracing the edges of everything. If that's the look you like, go for it. I want to talk more about this kind of highlighting, which I like to call in my head volumetric highlighting, where you're actually paying attention to the volumes of the model and how they're going to interact with light to give it, a better sense of, in my opinion, scale and size and shape and define everything a lot better. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. So one of the biggest things, right, is where's your light? That's something I always think about when I'm painting a model is like what light have I picked for myself and where and how is it going to intersect with the shapes of the model. So this is just sort of a basic lighting reference shot. Generally, I think that we tend to put light a little bit overhead when we paint models, which I think works well because you get better shadows underneath stuff that way. Where the light falls, it isn't all that important in terms of like how it changes everything. It's your choice, right? Like you get to decide where you want the light to be coming from. That's part of our end goal that we're looking for as painters is to try and render this in a certain way, and light's going to be the way that we do that because light's going to give us all of our information. I think typically, especially for people that are starting to just learn how to do like interpret the volumes well, just doing a general studio lighting, like something like this, across the whole model from all angles works the best, and you're not trying to worry about multiple light sources interfering with each other, how they're going to interact. You can just kind of light the whole model as if it's sitting in a well lit studio with relatively soft light coming from all sides. So similar to the non-metallic metal video that we went over the other day, we're going back to the basic forms because this is how we're going to see how light interacts with our model. I find that the faster you can mentally break the model down into its basic shapes, the easier time you're going to have understanding how to paint that model. And for me, at least, there's like a few stages of this, which we'll get into a little bit more in a minute in terms of like macro versus micro volumes of the model. Um, Everything starts at like very big broad strokes and then gets broken down further and further and further. I think especially because we're working on small stuff and there's a lot of detail, we often have a tendency to jump way ahead and just start rendering out the finest details on there without paying attention to the background shapes, and that can make things look kind of weird. Things may not match up, or especially I see it a lot with anatomy. You end up like islanding the muscles from one another because you're paying too much attention to the smaller volumes within it and not the bigger overall shapes. But basically, any model you look at, just try and think about, okay, is that part that I'm looking at, is it a sphere? Is it a cube? Is it a sphere plus a cube? Is it a cone plus a cylinder? It's some combination of these shapes, and just figuring out what that is definitely like the thing that I spend the most time in the beginning doing is just moving the model around, looking at it, going, okay, well this is kind of a cone, so I know the light's gonna do this on it. This shape here is half a sphere, so it's gonna do this, this, and this. And just kind of getting a game plan from that, I think is a good early all helpful steps. Here's just a look at light interacting with one of the shapes of the sphere here. You can see we've got our main highlight here, and our midtones, and then what's called the core shadow or terminator wraps around, and then generally um, shapes like this you'll get some reflection of the light off of the surface that it's on for this reflected highlight, but that's not as important. But just thinking about, if this is a head, right, like most of the light in this situation would be hitting the forehead, right? If we're looking at the head as a circle. It's not going to get quite as dark underneath the other parts because the head's not a perfect circle like this, so the occlusion of the shape is going to be a bit different. But generally, if you bring most of the light into like the foreheads and the upper cheeks that would fall in this region, then it's going to work out well. And that's just what I mean of trying to see this shape in the other, the more complicated shapes of the model. This is an example from the second FAQ book that Arnau Lazaro did. And I think this is a really good example of what I'm talking about here. So with this like alien ferret whatever it is, breaking this down into some basic shapes first, right? So the head's going to be a sphere, the neck here is going to be a column, and then the chest gets to be a little bit more complicated, but basically it's like a cube with a column removed from it right here along the shelf of like where the collarbones would be. So it is basically just a cube with a chunk taking out of it. So it's got a curved surface in here now, where you can see the light sloping on it, but mostly it's still flat planes. And breaking these down into this, now you get your what I was talking about with the macro volumes. You get your overall bigger shapes here first, right? Like there's a lot more complicated, smaller shapes within the head, but overall we do want the lighting to represent the circular shape, and you can see how it's rendered with most of the light hitting here, and it being darker around the edges as it is on the sphere. Similarly with the column of the neck, most of our light's going to be over here, wrapping around a little bit. We've got a lot of light on this top shelf of the chest, with it fading off as it comes down these planes here. Um, Getting this in now just is super helpful. Like if you skip this consideration, you go right to rendering out the face, it can often look really weird because you didn't pay attention enough to the general overall shape, in the beginning. Once you do have that in and figured out though, and like you don't have to be putting this on the model, it's just a mental thing of like making sure that you keep this in mind as you start painting, then we can start to think about the smaller volumes within the larger one, right? So the shapes of the eyes, are almost like cylinders that are wrapped around where the eyes are carved out. They're very round shapes. Similarly here, the tops of the musculature, the face, and everything. Um, but having these now rendered in with the overall attention to the way the light's falling is just going to make it look a lot more realistic. And this is definitely a good place to use reference. Finding pictures of something even somewhat similar to what you're painting with light falling on it and using that as a map is super helpful. Even if it's not the exact lighting you're trying to accomplish, just looking at the way the light is interacting with the different shapes and surfaces, I think will give you a better idea of what that topology would look like in certain lights. But again, with this, I think that when people skip to this too fast, you can often get very like a look that's not harmonious. Like things look like they're very separated from one another. Whereas if you really pay attention to the overall shape early on, they definitely come together better. Here's some more examples of just that sort of mindset of breaking the model down into its component shapes, right? Like here, we can imagine this arm, even though it's not really there, would have been a cylinder, so that creates this cylindrical volume. Similarly, the whole main chest here is a cylinder, and you can see Arno marked it out with this red line where this is the main light path. It's a lot brighter here, and it sort of fades as it comes around this cylindrical shape to the sides here. The light's going to taper off a bit. Similarly, he's marked out, the top of this helmet as a cone, so it's going to have very similar reflections to a cylinder, but they're going to taper to the tip and all kind of come together. Um, this one's mostly cylinders, right? Like we've got a cylinder going this way around the trunk of his body, but then the top of his shoulders also make a cylinder going this way, where you can see he's written double curve. We've got kind of two curves intersecting at once, so that definitely starts to create more considerations of the way the light's going to be, because the surface is now bending in two different directions simultaneously. It's not as straightforward as, say, rendering out the column of his neck here. But just with some reference and experimentation, you can definitely figure out what that's going to look like with light on it. We got his another conical shape down here. We've got sort of a boxy shape on the squared off um, hilt of whatever he's carrying. Similarly over here, thinking about what the shapes are and how they're facing in relation to the light is really important too. Like here, the top of her chest is basically a box, and if the light's coming in, you know, from this direction, it's going to be catching most of that in comparison to this down here, which is angled away. You know, this would be catching more of this like colored light, I guess, if the colored light's coming from, I don't know what direction it's coming from, but just thinking about where and how you can separate up the model, think about what sides are getting what light from what direction, everything like that. Um, the more planning, the better with all of this. Uh, and again, you don't have to be doing this on the model, but just looking at it, thinking about it, trying to figure out, okay, what's this shape here? What's it doing? Where is my light coming from, and how do those two things interact? I think is really the meat of envisioning where your light's gonna fall. Um, I'm just going to work with some layering today because I think that's the easiest way to render out volumes. Just thinking about, you know, your steps of light moving up, getting smaller, and heading towards the principal point of where the light's coming in. So if we thought about this maybe wrapped around a cylinder, right? Like at the back of the cylinder, you'd have where these two very dark shadow tones overlap. And then as we come around the curve of the cylinder, we'd be working up through, you know, progressively brighter tones till we got to the point on the cylinder that was facing the light. And for me, that's just how I have this mental image in my mind of these layers of color and value wrapping around an object, getting smaller and smaller as they work towards the point where the light is ultimately hitting directly. All right, well, that's all I had for a little fireside chat here. So we can go flip over to camera.
And if anyone has any questions, post them in there's a text channel for this stage. It should be in the top right corner of your screen. Just post the question there and tag me, and I'll ask it when we have.
Oh, how do I make this big? Oh, I can't. Okay. Oh. So I picked. We'll see if I can do better at staying on camera today. Um, I picked this Kingdom Death model, Gold Smoke Knight for today, just because here, let's see if I can get this a little brighter. I think that it has very prominent and easy to define shapes to it. It's just not focusing. Oh, it's on auto. Anyway, like his chest belly area is very much so, you know, a sphere. It's very spherical. It's very easy to see that. His legs are very much, you know, columns, and then these are more like cones down here. As they pull in towards his ankle, it actually flares back out, so you've got kind of a cone going into a cone, um, which will be important later. These are basically a cone. Why is that just not focusing at all today? Let me see if I can get this a little cleaner. Huh. All right, well, his head's very much another sphere. So just thinking about, you know, if the light was coming at him sort of from the front, from the top and front, and we're gonna say just general soft highlighting around the whole thing, we could start thinking about how we're gonna render out some of these shapes. I'm just gonna do this in like a purpley color because it sounds fun. Um, and I'm just gonna be layering up from dark, so I'm gonna be starting with more of like a shadowy color. In this case, I've mixed sort of blue into a purple tone. We're gonna work from there. Just need to take my hat off because I keep hitting the camera with it. With this too, I mean, you could definitely work like I did in the non-metallic metal video of just marking out all your highlights. Although I generally, I kind of like layering up for something like this, so that's the way I'm gonna approach this. Just get some dust off of this thing here. So when I like to work, I generally am like I don't want to base coat this whole model in the shadow tone. I don't see the point because I know I'm going to be painting highlights up and above, so I'm literally just going to come in and paint where the shadows are going to end up. Um, and when I do, I'm going to be thinking about this as if it is, a sphere that I'm rendering. So I'm going to have the shadow try and wrap up more around the edges at the side, where kind of like that shape that we looked at before. Um, as it gets away from the light, the shadows are larger and darker, wrapping around the backside of this shape here. And then we've got a slightly brighter color coming up the front here. A little dry in here today. And this is more of our like mid-tone putting on. And you can see too, like I'm even very much ignoring the like slits in his armor and everything like that. That's more where I'm talking about the difference between these macro overall large volumes and then the micro volumes of like the more detailed topology of the model that we'll get into defining later. Because right now it doesn't matter as much. We just want to make sure that the general feel of the shape is right, and then adjust it if it isn't. And if everything feels good, then it's easier to go in afterwards and kind of cut in the shapes and bring them out more. So we're gonna grab another layer up. It's just brighter, more saturated purple at this point. Man, these scale 75 artist colors really smell. Why won't this focus though? Alright, we're gonna try something here. Yeah, that's better. Do a little manual focus. I guess one of the things too when we're talking about highlighting, like we can think about color theory a little bit with this, right? Um, so for this, if I just did this in just purple tones, like it would look pretty good. But I think that shifting the hue a little bit when you're playing around with how you're applying the highlights can make it feel a lot more dramatic and effective. So in this case, I'm going to go from more of like a blue color in the shadows up to like a magenta color in the highlights. So it's a bit of a rotation around the color wheel. Ooh, there he goes. Which should give it some better contrast, not just in terms of value, but also in terms of the hue. It'll be a little bit stronger that way than if we just went straight through from dark purple to bright purple. Just drying a little bit. In this case, we're going to grab a little bit of magenta into our mix here, make it a little bit brighter, and we'll come up to the top of this round shape a bit. And up here. I think another thing to think about with highlighting is not only like, okay, we've got all of our shapes and we know how to highlight them. That part I think is kind of the easier step of it, and then the next is a little bit of like kind of like hierarchy on the model. I generally find that your brightest highlights that are on the model should be in whatever zone you're trying to pull focus to. So even if we're doing like pretty consistent studio lighting across the whole thing, I still wouldn't have highlights down on his knees anywhere near as high as they are up on his upper chest and face, just to help pull focus there and make sure that this is what we're looking at a majority of the time. We want to look around and say, okay, this is cool, but this is where we want the eyes to rest eventually. So that's just another consideration is like if you think about the overall model as like a gradient of focus, it definitely goes up as you get up to here towards the head. Similarly, in from the sides, just sort of where you're trying to draw the attention to. Um, it'd be really easy to make all of the attention on the top of his belly and lose the head entirely, and then I don't think it would look quite as cool as if we do like a cool highlight on the stomach, but still make sure that the focus is on the face eventually. And just bringing up some more color here. Let's do a little blue. Um, Another thing that I think that I see a lot when people are mixing up colors for highlighting, like if you're not just using progressively brighter bottles of color, um, I would try and challenge yourself to involving like a white or white heavy color towards the end of where you're mixing up for your highlight, right? Like I see it too often where people start incorporating white in their midtones, and then by the time you get up to your ultimate highlight, it's just completely blown out. There's no color anymore because you've added so much white along the way. Like when mixing the color, like over here, this is the armor so far. There's no white in here yet, and I probably don't need to for another. After I do just the pure magenta, I'll add the tiniest bit of white to that for the next layer. But we're still already quite a few steps along the way before we're starting to bring any of this like whitish color in. And that's a good way to keep your saturation is to just rotate around the color wheel when you're adding your highlights to you know use a more saturated color, which is generally lighter in value depending on what color it is. So again, at this point, I feel pretty good about the overall light to dark that we've got in terms of this bigger shape. So from here, that's the point where I would start thinking about now picking out some of the more micro volumes out of this to start giving definition to and bringing the light up in their individual elements. So now we've gone from the larger size and now we're focusing on smaller, and then at the end we'll focus even smaller to give this all more shape. Maybe a little bit more in this. We'll get a little paint on the head too, just for fun. All right.
You're pretty out of focus right now.
All right, I'm just gonna let that dry for a sec. Anybody got any questions?
No, there's no questions yet. Again, if you have any questions, post them in the text chat for this channel. It's in the window in the top right corner of your screen. You can post them there and tag me.
Tag him. Tag the man.
Tag me.
So for here, like with the magenta, I've got just the straight magenta there. Um, I'm going to take just the tiniest bit of this ice yellow and mix it in. And it's not even like a huge change that we just made, but it's enough that it'll be quite present on here when we go to put it on the model. And then for the next one, I'll go even a little bit more desaturated. I find that if we go too much past this with adding white though, um, it's just not going to look like purpley magenta anymore. It's going to look mostly like this white color. There's a few ways you can get around that. Like if you go and it's too white, you can always take a more saturated version of your color and really thin it out to a glaze and glaze that color back in. You won't lose as much of the value if you do. Just make sure it's a really nice soft glaze. Something like this where it's adding the hue but not a lot of opacity to it. You can see with something like that, it's really just that's what glazing should look like. Really, really soft. I think that's where a lot of people mess up with glazing is they go in with something that's way too opaque still, and it's not even really doing what it should. So we'll move up into this next one here, and so this, now that we're looking at, let's see if I can get this to focus up here a little bit better. Now that we're looking at the smaller volumes of everything, right? I'm gonna stop considering as much the overall circular shape that I have up here and start thinking like, okay, well this is two rectangles that meet, right? And this is two other kind of flat planes that meet. This gets a little bit flatter, this stays pretty round. So we do want to think about the overall roundness of it and where the light's going to fall, but now we also have to start paying attention to what these shapes are and how the light's going to interact with those. So like in this case, because there's this sharp edge across, that's going to catch light pretty heavily. Um, we'll just kind of center weight the highlights because we're thinking about the light coming in from the front. If the light was coming in from this side, obviously it would catch more on this face. You'd have darker shadows over here. But if we're coming at it from the front, it's going to be pretty evenly weighted between the two sides.
What brand are you using for the magenta?
Chimera. I think this is
Are you only using Chimera magenta?
at the moment.
I mean,
Yeah,
all the magentas on your palette.
there's Chimera. So this is Chimera magenta. This is Chimera Tenebris teal, and this is Scale Artist. What is that one called? Dark Violet, which is pretty
What was the
magenta-y.
teal called?
Tenebris teal from from Chimera from Magenta.
Tenebris.
Yeah, it's Eric Swinson's from the mixed artist pack they did.
Yeah.
Taintibris.
Paintibris. Shiny.
Taintibrush. So here's still gonna get some light, but not as much. This shape will get a lot of light. One thing too, I think that people don't think about is like we're gonna highlight up, highlight up, highlight up, but the thing that's really gonna make this pop is gonna be going back and adding some dark lining later. And it seems counterintuitive that working dark is going to be what really makes your highlights and lighting shine, but that's what it is. It's contrast, right? You have to have that contrast for things to feel bright. If you have just a lot of like bright things next to a lot of medium value things, they don't feel as bright as if they're next to dark things. That's one of the things people mean when they say contrast and fail to follow up with contrast of value. Um, what they're talking about is contrast values.
For more directional light, how would you suggest keeping track of where the lighting is actually hitting?
So take your model, either get it wet or hit it with gloss varnish or have a satin like the only way that this doesn't work is when you have a very matte primer, and even then it still kind of works. Take your model, put it under the light in the direction that you want it to be, and take a picture of it. Keep that picture on your phone and just have it next to you when you're working on it. There's your reference. That way you're not sitting there like trying to think, okay, what's it gonna do here? Is it gonna do this? Like, take all those pictures beforehand, and then you just get to, pull it up on here. Okay, cool. This is what it needs to look like. You can even see it right now, kind of with this model, right? If I want to do the side lighting, this is already giving me kind of a great reference where the light's hitting here, and you can really get a sense of this round shape. Like, just follow that. That's going to give you the result you want. You can already see the light kind of hitting here at this angle. If you follow that, it's going to give you the end result. There's a little bit more tweaking that you have to do because like we're working at a different scale than what the light is, but that just comes with practice and observation. But yeah, reference material, um, especially if you're trying to push like the overall quality of the models. Like I think working with references can really help, and a lot of people overlook that, unfortunately. So start picking out the top of this thing a bit. Gonna come up in these shapes a little more. This damn filigree is gonna be annoying later though. And in some of these areas, we'll go even brighter. And again, we are really just layering. It's just smaller and smaller layers over the previous ones, working up towards our ultimate lights. Um, I'm working pretty thin right now, so that it's just kind of doing a bit of blending on its own. Might even bring a little stronger midtones in. Lost them a little bit.
What is your process for working with similar colors but different surface quality, e.g., shine, material, etc., like cloth versus plastic?
I mean, I think that really just comes down to like thinking about like considering the material and what about that material sells it, right? Like with cloth, it's the prevalence of texture, right? The fact that there is a texture, and if we create that texture, our brains think, okay, yeah, that looks like cotton. Um, so just working to capture that, like for most cloths, I tend to stipple because I think it gives a very nice, soft cloth-like feel to it visually. And I would work the same. I would just, instead of using brush strokes for the layers, you're just stippling smaller and smaller areas. So you're just you start off with this, then you're shrinking to this, then you're shrinking to this, then you're shrinking to this, till you've got your ultimate final highlights. Skin, I tend to stipple too, and then glaze a bit. I think that gets you a nice end result. Um, but yeah, it comes down to information for sure. You could ostensibly you could make this armor feel like it's made out of padded cloth or something you know with the right interpretation of it. And that's where we kind of do get some of our freedoms as painters, is like you don't have to follow exactly what the sculpt says. There's ways to trick it around and make it feel different than it is. Bring more light onto this part. Of course, I picked a really transparent color to try and layer up, so that's Going nice and slow. And then, if you start thinking about even the smaller bits here, right, like thinking about how within the bigger context are these little pieces of filigree going to catch light. They're going to catch it a little bit more. Wow, that was amazing, Red. That's in the recording now.
Perfect.
I'm not editing it out. Beautiful.
So I can ask questions.
And like most things, this is always going to be a little bit of a back and forth to find the right balance so that the volume feels like it's rendered out the right way to you. Um, I probably need to bring a little bit more of the bright magenta into this top section too to kind of match the overall curve of everything. Fortunately, there's not a lot of place to put paint. There's too much detail. And we can go just a little bit brighter for the final bits.
One, are you intentionally leaving the brownish color showing for shadow, or will you eventually go over it with magenta to use the
Um,
primer?
uh, there's, I mean, around the shadows, I'll kind of leave it. I might glaze into it a little bit to soften it after I come back and maybe add um, some dark lining. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, you can leave some shadows in places. Um, so this is what I was talking about earlier. I only added a tiny bit of white, and already it's gone to this doesn't look magenta anymore, right? Like there's too much white in it now. Um, and that's okay. It'll happen. This is just part of trying to get up in value. Is sometimes you're gonna lose the saturation, and that's okay. You can always resaturate colors. It's not the end of the world. Um, it's just I wouldn't leave it like this, and I think a lot of the time it does get left like this, and I don't particularly think that it looks great. Obviously, if you're happy with it and you like the way it looks, go for it. I just think that there's too much white in something like this, and it doesn't look right. So like we were talking about before, I would just grab, in this case we want pretty saturated magenta over these areas, so I would just take like something in here and water it out till we get a nice glaze going. Um, Again, it's not really impacting, it's not leaving a ton of pigment behind, and that's okay. But we're just gonna glaze it over this a few times, and that'll not only help blend it into the layers around it, which in this case maybe it's a little bit too stark of a jump to just get glazed in unless you want to do it a million times, but this is a good way to start recapturing the color. Like you can already see it's a lot less white even just after that one pass of glazing. Um, and that's with a lot of colors. You're gonna have to do that if you really want that really vibrant and high value color at the end. Is you're gonna have to paint it with a mix of white and then glaze the color back over it. Like that's how I get a good vibrant red. Is just take pure white, even sketch in your final highlight shapes and areas, and then glaze that red, especially red ink, back over it, and you'll get a really nice juicy red that way. I think that myself looks better than mixing in like yellow or orange and just leaving it that way, because then you do lose a lot of the hue information. And again, we're just taking that glaze and working it back over here. And like while it does knock some of the value down, it's still enough that it still works. You know, it's still very high value. Um, Probably around the edges we need to soften it in a bit, so I usually just take a mid-tone and sketch over it a bit. Similarly, like for the blue, I think blue you can add white in a little bit earlier and it won't really mess it up too much, especially if you have a really saturated blue to start. Um, this just has a little white in it, but it's still very much blue. We want to render the front of his head, kind of the tops of these face shapes, and that's our kind of beginning sphere, right? I'm not worrying too much about being fussy on any of this because I just work messy and clean it up later. This works better for me. Saturate all that back a bit.
How do you determine when to use titanium white or ice yellow or ivory as a highlight mixer?
Um, I don't know. I mean, you just gotta kind of think about it a little bit. Like, I wouldn't use ice yellow with blue because it's blue and yellow makes green. You know, like this is going to skew towards green a bit more eventually. In this case, I would just use like an ivory color. Um, you can see it stays more blue and less blue green going this way. You know, you get more of like a. This will give you more of a sky blue. This would give you more of a turquoise. So I guess it's either way you want to go with that. Um, Titanium white. I mean, I generally don't use that a lot for mixing because the titanium is very strong. It overwhelms the other pigments, so that's why I like something a little softer, like one of these two. Just depending on if you want to go more towards the yellow, or I mean, this one does probably have a little bit of yellow in it, but obviously not quite as much because it doesn't change the character of the color quite so much. I don't know. Experiment. You know, what it really comes down to is you got to mix it into whatever paints you have, especially with miniature paints, and see what result it gives you. Try mixing all three, you know, one string each, and see what the end color is like, and if you like that one best. Like for something like the magenta, it doesn't matter quite so much which one you'd be mixing them with to get somewhere. Um, but like with a blue, you know, we could see it's a pretty different result. So with this, just thinking about volumes again, right? Like we might want to bring some edge highlights down from these panels because they have sharp edges, um, in tandem with the other rendering that we have on them, just to start giving things more shape. At this point, like, are probably a little further along, but I always really like to go in and dark line things just because it gives them a lot more separation from the other elements, which definitely makes the highlights feel brighter. Obviously, I usually do this at the very end instead of right now, but I just for the sake of teaching, I think it'd be good to give you a look at how much more contrast that can give you and help define the different elements of it. You know, just get a brush with a fine tip and a nice dark color that's going to work well in here, and just trace along the different elements. make it all pop a bit more. I think that can be a helpful mid step too if you're feeling like you've started to lose sight of what your shapes are, because you've been playing around and blending too much, and everything's looking a little bit muddy. Taking the time to go in and just dark line and clean it up a bit, I think can really make it easier to see to go back to and say like, okay, I need to move some things around. Like on this, I feel like maybe I placed these lights a little too far out, and I want to bring them up towards this middle point more. So I'm just gonna start shifting those up and away from the inside as much. I feel like in here it could be a little brighter. This could be brighter. Um, and I think one big thing too is like, it's gonna be hard because this will go out of focus, but holding your model back and just giving it a check, I find is very helpful for feeling if you've got the right whole thing going. When we're working this close, it can be really easy to lose sight of the overall look of the thing because you're focusing in on this one part for so long. So to give yourself that little bit of a different perspective for a minute, really helpful. Shift this up, out. Wait, mix again. One thing too that I just kind of thought of with what we were talking about with the shadows earlier being there. Um, if you find that they don't feel like they're the right color, like you can always just glaze some of your main color that you're working over them. Like if you took the mid-tone in this case, like this purpley color, and glazed it over the shadows a bit, um, it would make them feel less like that dark browny primary color and more cohesive to the overall look. Don't be afraid to work in both directions too. You don't always have to be working up. Working down is really helpful too. Glaze in some stronger shadows. Like even on this, it might be cool to take more of the saturated blue that we have and glaze some of it into the shadows. Probably give it some better pop. I say glaze, but that's a little stronger than glaze. But now I think we've got a little bit better sense of definition to the stomach area. That darker blue, and then maybe a slightly brighter purple color needs to come in here and bridge the two. Something like that.
You're a bit off camera, man.
Yeah, it's bound to happen. At least there's no head in it this time.
True.
What do we got for time? Let's put some of these dark lines in there. True, true, true. Yep. And from here, it's just doing it back and forth forever till it feels right. And there's no real secrets. It's really just pushing paint around and thinking about the volumes, and doing that over and over. And it definitely gets easier.
You're about at the hour mark.
All right, cool. I think we'll probably look at wrapping this thing up here. Um, last call for questions you like answered in the moment. Going once,
Will you
going
show some of the
twice.
stippling on cloth or skin that you mentioned?
Yeah, we could do a little quick stippling real quick. It's a good spot on here. We can kind of do it, and we'll kind of do it back in here or something. Let's see. We'll just use some brown tones real quick because I have those in a bottle. Give me one sec. Just getting some more paint. Okay. So we'll use these kind of brown colors. To start with, I usually use a slightly older brush. Like this one doesn't have the best tip anymore. Um, say we want to render some volumes in here. Just get my brush, take most of the paint off, and we'll just start stippling out the main shapes. For this first layer, I really don't worry about how clean it looks, that the edges are, or anything. We're really looking for texture in here, right? And that's why I'll use an old brush, because the tip's going to splay a lot. I don't care. Doesn't matter. Okay, so we've got sort of our first textural layer down. It's a little sloppy, that's fine. I'm just going to let that dry real quick. And then from there, what I tend to do is use a brush with more of a more of a tip, something more accurate. This shit still ain't dry. We'll just move up in tone again. I'll just go ahead and mix out the next one because I know we'll get into it pretty quick. Just sort of a lighter brown tone, and then an even lighter brown tone over here. Oh, my camera die?
Yeah, it's frozen.
Huh. Weird. What the hell happened to Streamlabs? How do I... Hmm. Oh, there we go. Is that working again?
Looks like it.
Yeah, alright, cool.
Yep.
Alright, so we've got some basic browns in there. It's got some basic textural shapes starting off there. We'll go to our next brown with a finer brush, and this is where it's a little bit more, accurate poking of the model. So I'm just going to think about the shape in here. As it's coming together, it's kind of this curve poking out towards us. So like the front of this curve shape is what I'm going to highlight. It's basically like a cone. Think about it. So it'll have a very triangular shape. And I'm just very kind of randomly poking in the general shape of the area that I want. Or area of the shape I want, I guess, rather. And we're just letting it build up some nice random texture. With this too, I like to work kind of thin, um, just so that you're not completely obscuring the previous layer. They're kind of blending together a little bit, keeping that all that randomness in there. So now move up again in the next tone that we've mixed, and now it'll be even more focused of an area that we work in. I think that's the biggest thing that I see when people are like, "Oh, I'm layering," and they cover 99% of their previous layer each time. Like that doesn't. You got to think about how wide each layer needs to be. How much area it needs to cover. You can see like that. I've already done a lot smaller of an area, shrinking in, than we did on the previous layer. And it's really shrinking as you like. I don't know. If you think about like an object like this, right? Like as it's coming toward you, the cross section of where the light's hitting is shrinking. It's getting smaller and smaller, and that's what you're seeing with layers. Like I was talking about them wrapping around earlier. Like when you've got this highlight on a column, it's only about this wide, so you only need to put your final highlight that wide. You don't want to cover the whole area with it, or you lose the shape of the volume, or rather the sense of the volume. And we can take our brightest one here. Again, this is another instance, right, where we've kind of lost our color information for the most part. We're basically just painting with a white right now. Which if you just left it like this, I don't think it looks very good. I think it looks like you've just put a lot of white dots on something. Um, so we've got that, right? That's kind of our stippled up highlighting in here. And this is how I generally work with like leathers and certain types of cloth. Um, what I like to do at this point after we've got the texture on there is use something uh, like like a contrast, like the snakebite leather, or like a sepia ink, or chestnut ink, or something in that ballpark. Um, and what we'll do with this is we'll just get some on the palette, thin it down a bit so it's a nice glaze consistency. And even this is kind of a strong glaze. Like you can see, it's quite punchy, but it's pretty transparent. It just is rich. And I will just glaze that over this whole area, which will bring the color information back into it and also soften the transition between the layers. We've already got it. It's a lot browner now that we've put that on there. We'll let that dry and probably do it a few more times to bring it together. Maybe another round of stippling with these two after that, if we feel like we knocked it down too much. Successive layers of like stippling and glazing and stippling and glazing are a really nice way to build up a really deep, nuanced textural look, because with each pass that you're washing, you're changing the ones that are already there, whereas the new layers are only getting washed once or twice. So you definitely get a lot more like random tones throughout the whole thing because of it. Yeah, it looks dry enough. Who cares?
Do you go over a mini with a, or do you go into a mini with a color plan? If so, how do you determine the colors that you want to paint the mini?
Um, I I've tried to more lately. I generally like to think about like picking one main color that I want to have in there for sure, like a strong saturated color. Like say if in this case it was this like purpley magenta color. I would start with that, knowing that's what I really want, and then planning around things that'll work with it. Like in this case, I think a blue, especially a little bit less saturated blue, would work really well with this, depending on how fantastic, how fantasy you want it to feel. And then, from there you've got say blue and magenta, so we'd be looking at, working in things across the color wheel as a third accent color, like maybe bringing a green in here somewhere, basically. Um, but I think just starting with your main color and working off from there, whether you want to use an analogous sort of scheme like this, if we just stayed within blues and purple through, magenta, we'd be pretty analogous. So it'll work. It would all feel really cold and kind of like, I don't know, aquatic almost. Or you can do more complementary, where you're moving across the color wheel and bringing in things that contrast really strongly on a hue level with this. Um, I recommend people to use that Adobe color picker site. It's really good. If you find the main color you want, they have all these different schemes that they can recommend you. You can play around with color. You can pull a picture of somebody else's work in there and pull out like the colors from their painted piece to see what their palette looks like, which I think is also really helpful in thinking about how other people approach this and getting a little bit of insight into their thought process. These monument brushes are really long.
What's the advantage of using a wash over contrast paint over regular paint for glazing?
Um, I don't see one all the time. It depends really on the product. Like washes are pretty they're not super strong in their pigmentation, a lot of them. They're like contrast is pretty punchy, right? Like I had to water that down quite a bit. You could just put it on straight over and it would just be like a really heavy glaze that would probably knock this way further down than it got knocked from just the glazing I did. Um, I don't know, experiment with them, see which one gives you the result you're looking for. I don't think that there should ever be like a hard rule about why you should use, this over this. Like it's a use case scenario. Mix them together even, see what the hell happens. Like I don't know. Rules about painting are just seem silly to me. Good experiment. See what works. What works for me may not work for you is the other big thing too. I can show people how I do it, but how you do it is going to be how you do it. All right, I think we're gonna wrap that up. I appreciate everyone coming out. Feel free to DM me if you've got further questions or anything. I'm always around. I think Red, you're planning on doing the next one, right, with skin tones?
Yeah, probably next month.
Cool. So keep an eye out for that. Hopefully, we'll keep doing some of these. If you guys find them helpful, if not, we don't have to. But thank you again, everyone, for showing out. It's always nice to see. Have a great weekend.
My mom.
This on the north side of town.
On the